Rydal, welcome.
Good afternoon, Godfrey.
No surprise, isn't it? I mean, East Africa has been pumping for years, and even when you talk about the leadership within the region, you get a sense of a people who are focused on actually getting growth going again.
You're absolutely right, Godfrey. There's a lot of infrastructure investment going on in East Africa, and there is obviously pushed growth. Whether you talk about Tanzania's close to 7% growth rate, Kenya 6% and above for the past few years, and even Uganda recording very strong growth for the past few years, and even as north as Ethiopia in East African space has been excellent growth. Last year they were a little bit unlucky with poor weather conditions, and still they were able to sustain growth at very, very good levels.
Yeah. Are you saying that growth is in the main due to the infrastructure spend? Is there any structural reform that's driving that growth there as well?
There has certainly been a lot of reforms in most of those markets. But yes, the infrastructure focus has really been driving growth in the region, and I think for the next few years it's going to continue to drive growth, especially when you think about the oil developments in especially Uganda and of course Kenya as well, and Tanzania of course on onshore development of some of the gas is continuing.
Yeah. One little surprise for me in that report was that West Africa was being outpaced by North Africa, because I always like to say it's East, West, and then South. I forget the North part of it.
Yeah. So certainly the West Africa has been a little bit dragged lower by Nigeria, which is the largest economy, of course, not just in the region, but also in the sub-Saharan space. And they've grown only, I think, around 2% last year. But you do have little gems like the Senegals and the Ivory Coast, etc., that's continue to deliver strong growth. And of course, Ghana has also been, despite a little bit of a drop in growth towards the end of last year, has also been growing quite solidly.
Absolutely. Dare we talk about our own region here, and we know who's dragging down Southern Africa, don't we?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. The financial capital of Africa, it is South Africa, isn't it? That's the problem in Southern Africa.
Yeah, of course, South Africa has not performed as well as we expected. I was just looking at the AfDB's forecast for at least for 2020, and they believe South Africa can grow at 1.1%, but it's still going to be a challenge.
Is that their official forecast?
That's the AfDB's forecast, at least
for 2020.
For 2020.
It's on the high side, isn't it,
so
compared to what we've had from others?
But yeah, they also but on the high side when you look at Nigeria and Angola. Nigeria, for example, they've got 2.9% growth, and Angola 2.8%, if I remember correctly. Where my own forecast for those two markets are rather more subdued, and I believe the IMF has also got them at slightly lower levels. So the AfDB seems to be a little bit more upbeat on growth prospects than the rest of us, and they do believe, of course, that investment is now driving growth rather than consumption. So that is likely to continue to sustain growth.
Maybe Rydal, they think that Isabel dos Santos is going to return part of the 2.2 billion that she siphoned out of the country, and is going to help pump that economy. Let's talk about one economy that has been standing out for the whole wrong reasons. Zambia, a darling of the past, one of those countries that we were saying was inside that 7 out of 10 fastest growing economies in Africa, sadly falling on hard times. Maybe just analyze for us here what has gone wrong.
So I think a whole lot. There's been, over the past few years, quite a shift in spending towards development spending, and I think the revenues have not exactly matched the spending. So we've seen large fiscal deficits in Zambia. Then at the same time, we've seen, especially in the beginning of last year, the new tax reforms that impacted on the mining sector, and that resulted in slightly lower production there as well. I think production on the copper side is 7% lower than previous. A number of reasons, but including the tax regime. Agriculture, they also experienced a drought, so it's a little bit of a perfect storm coming through for Zambia, but it didn't help that I think that they probably could have looked for outside help a lot faster and consolidated the fiscal position a lot sooner. So they've probably been a little bit slow on that response, but they are of course trying, but it's going to be another tough year, I believe, for them.
You're suggesting the IMF should be coming in here, or they should be getting the IMF in here?
Well, they have been talking about getting the IMF for more than 5 years.
Exactly.
It is difficult to see how they're going to access international capital markets, given the current debt dynamics and fiscal numbers that they have.
Expand a little bit on those dynamics, because we're talking about that big bond that's coming up, isn't it? 2022.
Yeah, 2022 bond. They were still looking for ways to refinance that bond, etc. So they certainly do have some challenges on that side. We also have the election 2 years away. So that's going to cause a little bit of nervousness, I think, on the fiscal side.
Yeah.
And I do think that the IMF will probably make a difference, especially in getting the focus back on prioritizing the spending and reducing these last fiscal deficits that we've seen.
But in the meantime, inflation is running away. I mean, I remember last year when we talked about their budget, inflation was supposed to be under 9%, and here we are sitting, what, 14?
12.5%, the latest number for January, coming up from 11% end of last year.
Is that all largely due to the currency?
It is, I think it's a combination of, as I've said earlier, the drought in the region has been pushing food prices up for a while, but also the currency, especially towards the end of last year, fourth quarter, jumped, I think, nearly 10% or around those numbers. And that has, of course, put inflation under pressure. And I think for the remainder of this year, or for the rest of this year at least, they are going to see a lot of inflationary pressures coming through. So there's potential for inflation to tick even higher than the current level.
Yeah. If you had 100 million Rydal, where would you put it on the African continent? No.
I think you've got to look at East Africa, as you suggested earlier. It's certainly the place to be. Like I said, the outlook is certainly bright over the next few years. And with them working on the EAC and getting it all together, a huge market and a huge opportunity there.
Absolutely. Nothing for Southern Africa?
It's a bit of a mixed story, but yeah.
The contrarian view. Could Zimbabwe bounce back?
Who knows what's going to happen there? But there's certainly opportunities, I think. And long term, I think the Southern African region should improve.
Absolutely. Long term. Depends on whether we'll be around to see the long term. Thank you, Rydal. Rydal Marcus, Africa Strategist at ABSA Corporate and Investment Banking.